Many years ago, when we were still stuck in an apartment in the city and dreaming of a different life, I did what any person in that situation would do and look up content of how life could be. YouTube wasn't as flooded with off-grid content as it is now, so one of the few channels I found was Off-Grid with Doug and Stacy. They looked like a sweet couple living simply in their wooden cabin. Sure, their clothing style was a little bit different, but I don't generally judge people on what they choose to wear. Their content showed gardening and cooking with their homegrown food, tips on the different aspects of off-grid living, and just a general look into what off-grid life could look like. All good and normal, right? Now, 5 years into my off-grid journey, I don't watch that type of content that much because it is my life now. So one day when YouTube decided to recommend one of their latest videos, I was left with one big question. What in the world happened to Doug and Stacy? Hi, my name is Leia and I have lived off-grid with my family for the last 6 years. This is my new channel where I share my particular insight on off-grid homestead grifters. To start, who are Doug and Stacy? Doug and Stacy are a couple in their late 50s who live in their self-built cabin on their 11-acre property in Missouri. In their own words, in 2010, we decided to sell everything and build a log cabin on 11 acres. We have lived in the log cabin for a decade now with no solar power or wind power, plus 0 public utilities. We live like the pioneers in the 21st century. We post videos on social media to encourage people to return to the land and make a living with your family. We teach folks off-grid living, rainwater catchment, cooking with wood, food growing, cooking from scratch, raised bed gardening, food harvesting, fermenting the harvest, food preservation, holistic remedies like grandma made, how to make money and live this life, storing food in a root cellar, DIY build projects, animal husbandry, raising chickens, guinea, turkeys, and ducks. All of our videos are made to empower you to break free and live your best life. All in all, a pretty standard story. Got sick of the city life, decided to move to the country and grow their own food. We've seen it a million times by now. Heck, I am one of those people who made that move. A good thing to remember though is that Doug used to be in sales. A few years after moving onto their property, Doug starts posting videos on YouTube to just share some things on the homestead. They post their first video, or at least that is the earliest video that is public, on June 15th of 2013. So they've been at this for a long time. YouTube was a completely different platform back then, and to me these first videos really do look like someone who's just sharing what he's doing and maybe make some friends along the way. For the first years, their content really was about all things homesteading, like building and growing food, and this content did pretty well. Everyone in this space knows who Doug and Stacy are, and over this last decade they've garnered up to 1.3 million subscribers. So this is a really big channel. And we could leave it at that. Just take what they're feeding us on very surface level, but that would make for a very short video. So let's go a little bit deeper. Who are Doug and Stacy really? What is off-grid even? And what do their systems look like? Let's discuss. So in essence, off-grid is really very simple. It just means not being connected to the grid and instead building your own independent systems to meet those very basic needs. More colloquially, off-grid also means an independent, self-sufficient lifestyle, usually somewhere remote and more cut off from society. So what kind of systems have Doug and Stacy built over these last 14 years? Let's have a look, because as someone who has lived off-grid for the last 6 years, I definitely have some thoughts. But before we go any further, I am the first to admit if I have missed something. There are over a decade worth of videos on this channel with together almost 1,500 videos. So I've done my very best to dig through all the different aspects that I will discuss in this video. But in case I have missed something, feel free to leave a comment correcting me. This video is just to share my thoughts and opinions on the systems as they have presented them online for people to watch and learn from. Let's start with the most basic thing, the thing that we all need to do basically anything in life. water. In their description, they state that they have no public water, which, because you're supposedly off-grid. So I've watched quite a few videos on their water system, and I could not find an explanation as to why they do not have a well on their property. I understand that they can be very expensive to put in, especially if you have to go very deep and you might need to save up for that. And personally, I also have the concern that you're touching water that has been built over tens of thousands of years. So once you pump out all that water, especially as a community, that water is gone and it will not be refilled. So there's definitely some concerns with a well. And even if it's an issue of electricity, which we will touch on in a moment, at the very least you could do is put in a gasoline pump, or even a hand pump. There are many options to make things a little bit more accessible and a little bit more affordable. But as far as I could find, he never really gives an explanation as to why they do not have a well. Instead, what they did for the first 4 years is haul water from somewhere else. Again, it's very unclear to me where they got this water. It might be their pond, it might be their neighbor, it might be some city spring. It's never really explained. But for 4 years, they drove to fill up tanks to provide their homestead with water. And they needed quite a bit of water because they always had big animals, horses and sheep, and they need a lot of water. So I can only imagine how much driving they did at the time and how much time that took out of their day to provide their homestead with this most basic thing. After 4 years, they, or mostly just Doug, I think, put in a rainwater catchment system. And this is a good system in theory, but there are some caveats that he also never mentions. For people who claim they love to do research, they seem to do very little or very surface level research, and they never really look at the science. But there definitely are some caveats to rainwater system in the world we live in today. Recent studies have pointed out that 30% of rainwater catchment from rooftops is contaminated with PFAS. This includes statistically significant concentrations of various fluoride substances above the US EPA lifetime health advisory level, which increases the risks of several cancers, reduces reproduction, and can cause significant health problems for children. Even non-potable water from rooftop collection can come with risks. High levels of fecal indicator bacteria in one assessment point to several potential opportunistic pathogens in tank water that can cause illness, even if not consumed through drinking. So, the rainwater catchment can be perfectly safe, but it also poses some serious risks. We live in an age where everything around us is just contaminated with all sorts of nasty stuff, and rainwater is no different. It's not some magical clean water that just falls from the sky for you to use as you please. That's just not the world that we live in anymore, sadly, but true. Obviously, you can work around those issues. You can do regular testing, you can do some serious filtration, you can do all those systems. But the problem is that Doug never mentions these things. And because they are quite serious, PFAS and fecal indicator bacteria, that doesn't sound very nice, these can have very serious consequences. So if you're trying to teach people, it is very important that you paint the whole picture and make a good pros and cons list for people to learn from, and not just say, put up a rain pipe, put down a tank, and just call it a day. The only thing he does mention, and I thought this was really strange because I've never heard this before, is that in the case that your tanks are running low and you might need to get city water to fill them back up, you should disconnect your pipe from the roof, because he says that if you mix the rainwater with the city water, it will start to smell weird and it will taste sour. Now, I've never heard this in my life, and if it is the case that that happens with him, that can't be good. I don't know what it is, but I don't think it's good. So after 4 years of hauling water, they finally have water on their property, and They gravity feed this water from these big tanks that they have in their barn down to their cabin, which is cool. I love a gravity fed system for the same reasons they do. Systems like this are much more foolproof because there are less parts that can break basically, and you're not dependent on electricity and that kind of stuff. So I love a gravity fed system, but it is an interesting choice for them because their property is fairly flat from all the footage that I can see. So there's not much difference between their barn and their cabin, which in turn has some consequences for their pressure, i.e. they have very little pressure because the only pressure that they have comes from the water that is actually in the tank and not from any elevation. And we can see this because they have a very tiny trickle that comes from the tap in their kitchen. So their water pressure is basically non-existent. And sure, you can live like that, but I just question why would you want to? Because water pressure makes everything better. You can't use a gas heater for your water. You can't use a dishwasher. I know that's controversial. You can't do so many things that make your life a lot easier. Just because he is anti-electricity and doesn't want to buy a pressure pump for some reason. Next up, the other most basic fact about life, a toilet. So Doug and Stacy use a composting toilet, and I understand why a composting toilet might be a little bit weird for people who are used to a flushing toilet and they've never been off-grid. But I fully appreciate and understand this system because we also use a composting toilet. Doug and Stacy have had different iterations of the same system, just a bucket in their bathroom inside their cabin.
There's our composting toilet, and there's our egg haul that we're cleaning up right now. We sell eggs a little bit to some, friends and whatever.
That they fill up with sawdust, and then every now and then they move this bucket out to start composting within their composting system. But what I do not understand for the life of me is why they have so many buckets. They don't just have one bucket that they empty once a week. They have 15, if not 20 different buckets that they fill up over time. And then once all these 20 buckets are filled up, they empty them all at the same time. I don't know if Stacy does this, but Doug does this in the video all the time. But I don't understand why it has to be this many buckets and why they don't just have one bucket that they empty out once a week, clean it out, and you're good to go. It just makes a job that could be 5 minutes every week into this hour-long, honestly kind of extra disgusting type of job. And then instead of just throwing it onto the compost pile every week, there's a bunch of buckets that are filled up just standing there next to the compost bin. I don't understand, but if this works for you, and for them, you go for it, I guess. Next up in their off-grid system is heat. This is pretty straightforward. They just use wood in their wood-cooked stove to heat their cabin throughout the winter, and they also cook on that. Personally, I think it's the system that makes the most sense, especially if you live out in the country where you can usually just buy wood fairly easily or go into the woods and get your own wood. It takes a little bit of getting used to, and it certainly is a little bit annoying in the mornings when it is cold and you have to start the fire, but all in all, a fairly basic system for people who live out in the country and live off-grid. As they say all the time, and also say in their description, they lived without solar energy or wind energy and are not connected to the electrical grid. Once again, duh. So for a long time, they lived with very minimal electricity. Personally, honestly, I do think it's very much possible to live without a lot of electricity, especially if you are just a couple and you mostly work from home. I think many people are very much taking electricity for granted and have become comfortable with all the luxury that electricity can bring. But seeing that grids are failing all over the place much more frequently than they did 20 years ago, I do think it's good to have a backup in case of an emergency. And I do think it's good to think through all the things that use electricity and how much they use, and how you would take care of yourself in a case that there was no electricity, even for a little bit. So I think that's good. For quite some time we had very minimal solar, and we learned to use electricity very sparingly at the time. But now we have a much bigger system, and we can very easily run a washing machine and even a dishwasher. And I'm just so grateful for that luxury, because I do know it's a luxury, but off-grid living is already challenging enough. So I grant myself that luxury. So with all that in mind, I do understand how Doug and Stacy lived with very minimal electric for such a long time. But what I, again, do not understand is why they lived or chose to live without proper electricity. In one video, Doug does very quickly mention that he does not see the return of investment in solar, which I understand, especially if you're thinking 10 years ago when the price of a decent solar system was much higher than it is these days. But even then, it does not make sense to me, because a lot of most off-grid systems cost a lot of money, upfront money to put in to get them going, which is why grids in theory are super cool and very nice, because you don't pay those upfront costs and you have someone else who can do the complicated stuff of installing and maintaining these systems. But to me, the upfront investment cost is not a reason or an excuse to not put that stuff in. But for whatever reason, for the first 8 years, they lived without electricity. And I put that in air quotes because obviously, as you do, they find some workarounds. They used to charge their smaller electronics in their car, which suggests to me that they do drive quite a bit, because they've always posted a couple videos a week, and you need a laptop to do that, so you need that charged, which is interesting because at the same time they also always talk about having the kind of property where you can just shut the gate and never have to leave. So where are they driving to so much? I'm just speculating here, of course, and probably underestimating American car culture. One thing that they do definitely drive for all the time is gas, because Doug does also show that they used a few different generators over the years to provide electricity when they need it. Related to electricity, they tried a few different things for refrigeration. In one of their first tour videos, you can see an old chest freezer that they fill up with ice to keep everything in there cool. And then you might be thinking, where are they getting this ice? And here's another workaround. They also have a freezer at their neighbor's house. So in essence, they are still connected to the larger grid system. They just don't have it on their own property. A few years later, they got an old-fashioned ice box that they again keep cool with ice from this freezer that they have at their neighbor's house. I always find looking at these old-fashioned ways of doing things very interesting and definitely worth looking into. But I think this icebox is just a bad idea. First of all, because the system that they used to have around these iceboxes at home no longer exists, so you can't keep it running in the same way. And I doubt that the temperature in this icebox is stable enough to keep your food cool properly, and they probably thought the same way, because after a few years they also bought a propane fridge, which is another very interesting choice, because sure, it's a good temporary solution. Lots of people in RVs have a fridge that runs on propane, but I don't think it's a good solution long term, because you need propane to keep it running. And at the least, if your goal is to have a small carbon footprint, you can't be relying on propane, i.e. fossil fuels, to keep your basic stuff running. but that's just my opinion. In November of 2019, they finally get solar panels. In the few videos that are still up about this system, it is very unclear if he was gifted this system or if he paid for it himself. However, in a video a few years later about their new solar system, he does say that he was gifted this old system as well, but he should have mentioned that properly, because that is important for people to know, as well as it's mandatory under FTC guidelines. I'm not sure if he actually posted a video talking through this whole first system. If he did, I can no longer find it, and it might be privated, but as far as I can see, he only promises the thing and then never delivers the thing. In the little bits that I can still find about the system though, it does become clear to me that he does not understand how it works, and thus why he probably did not start with solar in the first place. While reading the display from this first system, he's talking about voltages, where he should be talking about watts. He's talking about negative charge, whereas you would usually say that it's drawing from the system. I get it. Solar is complicated. I barely understand it myself, but I am also not here to try to convince you that I understand everything about a particular solar system. After using the Humless system for a few years, they are gifted a new inverter and batteries by Renogy, which is a big and reputable company within the solar installation realm. At the beginning of that video, he does explain that the old system never really worked properly, and Googling Humless, I do read quite a few bad reviews, so I can definitely understand, or I can definitely see that that is the case. But then a minute later in that same video, he also says that the solar panels were not properly installed. So I cannot help but wonder if maybe the entirety of that old system was just not properly installed, and that was why it wasn't working. Which I can see, because he is clearly out of his depth with solar. Anyway, so in 2022, they get a new inverter, and new batteries from Renogy. This time he does clearly say that they sent him these things, which again is mandatory under FTC guidelines. And if anything, it's just fair to your viewer to know that you were gifted these things, instead of that you spend your own money on expensive equipment. He installs the system and then does a walkthrough where he clearly reads off the information that he was sent by Renogy, which further underlines my suspicion that he is really out of his depth when it comes to solar anything. It's very unclear how much his solar panels produce, but seeing that they installed them in 2019, I don't think that they can be more than 200-300 watts a piece. With that in mind, and seeing how much stuff they end up running on the system, I think they probably run their generator every few days if it is not sunny, because the solar panels are simply not charging the batteries enough to run what they're trying to run on the system. And I see that a lot. People calculate their system based on perfect conditions, lots of sun hours, and that's really not the case throughout the year. So in theory, a system can handle this many things, but it only keeps the system healthy on perfectly sunny days, which is not most days. So then you end up having to charge your batteries through a generator or through the grid if you are also connected to the grid, which is fine. But personally, I don't like running the generator. So it's better to have a big system and then still keep using your system conservatively so that it's easier to bridge between sunny days, but that's just my opinion, of course. And then considering that he already ran his whole homestead on a generator before, he probably has less issues with running his generator to keep his batteries touched up. And then I'd also like to note that I'm not an electrician, but there are several electricians in the comments of that video who have some concerns about how his electrical work looks, which I have to agree on, but I'm not an electrician. And then, what about laundry? One of the many things that you can run on electricity. It has to be said that I truly believe with my whole heart that the washing machine is one of the greatest inventions in human history. I love my washing machine, and I don't even have a fancy machine. I just have a basic machine. But washing your stuff by hand, especially if you have a family, just takes so much effort and time out of your day that you could be spending doing other things. And many years ago, when we just arrived on this property and we were still a family of 3, we didn't have a washing machine for an entire year, so we had to do it either by hand or go to the laundromat, and that just took so much time. So now that we're at the point where we have a washing machine, I love that thing, and you can just put it in and walk away. Do keep in mind that we are a family of 4, so we have a lot more laundry. But with that in mind, I'm always interested to see how other people off-grid do their laundry. And it seems that Doug and Stacy have once again found an Amish-inspired workaround, a washing machine that works on their generator. In a video from 2016, they show how they do laundry, and they make a whole skit about it. But the funniest thing to me is that they put music over the part where they actually use the washing machine, so that you cannot hear how loud the machine is, or more importantly, the generator that is running that washing machine. While this machine does look cool, I doubt that they do laundry like this every week, or more specifically that Stacy does laundry like this every week, because Doug is very clear about the fact that it is Stacy's job to do the laundry. Anyway, for this video, they also move the machine. Why? I'm not sure. So we don't actually see how they really do their laundry every week. In the conclusion of that video, they do mention that they go to the laundromat when the weather is not good for a long time, or they have to do bigger things. And then Doug also mentions that this machine that runs on their generator, is already a compromise, because he would like for Stacy to use an even more primitive machine. And here is where we see, let's just call it what it is, a perfect example of Doug's sexism. Now let me go on a little side tangent here. One comment that I see all the time from men, obviously, is that my wife doesn't want to live off-grid. And this is exactly why. A certain type of man will drag his wife into this lifestyle, trying to live as primitive as possible, including, of course, traditional gender roles. What this in practice means, though, is that the wife has to do the housework, the daily housework, in the most laborsome way possible. In their little fantasy, they want their wife to go to the creek to wash their clothes every couple days, just like our ancestors used to do. You know, when they didn't have electricity and they really had no other choice. There is a reason that the moment that there was widespread electricity, we also invented machines that do this hard work for us. And there's a reason that the people that they talk about so much, the Amish, have also found a workaround to not be doing laundry by hand. So for him to say that she should do it in a more simple way is just so mind-boggling to me. I just know that he's never washed clothes in his life, especially not the hard way by hand. So why would you force this kind of labor onto your wife, is my question. I will never understand this. And if he was actually committed to this primitive, traditional way of life, he wouldn't have a skid steer or this nice logging machine that he has. You know, the machines that make his manly work easier. So, if you're ever wondering, why do none of these women want to go off-grid? That's why. To go back to their laundry, I think there are more laundromat visits than they would like to admit, which is fair enough, but this is not self-sufficient. A few years later, though, they do make another laundry video where they show Stacy using a more primitive machine. I'm fairly certain that layman's sent them this machine or this tool, because I've seen this same machine on other people's channels where they were clearly marked as sponsored, but Doug and Stacy are not clear about this. Once again, honestly, it looks like a cool machine and I would love to have this thing as a backup. But to me, it looks like, and some of the people in the comments seem to agree, that Stacy has clearly not used this machine very much. And why would she? Because they still also have this other machine. Either case, it's a great ad. They showcase how they use their favorite new products. Funnily enough, though, it does seem that after they made this video, and since Doug has become more extreme in his videos, Layman's no longer wants to be associated with them, which is all fair. I couldn't find a statement from the company itself, but I did find this comment by Doug where he doesn't seem very happy. To go on a little side tangent, not related to off-grid systems, but related to laundry, I wanted to quickly talk about Doug's clothing, because he's definitely making a statement by wearing the clothing that he does. As I said in the beginning of the video, I truly do not care what people wear and how they choose to express themselves. I don't judge people's fashion choices. People should wear whatever they feel comfortable in, and I love seeing all the different ways that people express themselves. That being said, though, I do have some thoughts about the clothing choices that Doug makes. In every single video I've seen of him, he's wearing these Amish clothes. And why is that? In a video from 2019, he explains that after they moved to the countryside and make this lifestyle change, they were also looking at their clothing choices and that they wanted to wear more natural clothes instead of the more chemical clothes like polyester and stuff like that. So that's why he made that choice to wear more natural materials and just dress more plain. So he went to the local Amish and had some clothes made for him. Apparently he loved these clothes so much that over time his whole wardrobe became these plain Amish clothes. He also talks about spending money locally, and he even goes on a little anti-Amazon rant, which I always appreciate, but it's a little bit rich from a guy who used to have a very long list of Amazon links in his description box.
We also are Amazon affiliates, so if you want to use our link for anything that you purchase on Amazon, it helps us here on the homestead, and we appreciate it.
I think it also goes a little bit deeper. They talk about the Amish all the time for all sorts of different things. They had furniture made by them, his clothes are made by them, they like to work together, they buy food. He even talks about going and learning from the Amish all the traditional skills that they have. In a way, I'm actually surprised that they haven't tried to become part of the Amish community. But people obviously have different interpretations of religion, and seeing that the Amish in his particular area are on the more conservative side of even the Amish, I wouldn't understand why that hasn't happened. But this obsession with the Amish that seems to be shared by his audience, if I can see that right in the comments, is very interesting to me, because it speaks to the appeal of authority that they give the Amish. There is this image of the Amish that I see all the time of people that know better because they work hard and they use all these traditional methods. They are simple but noble peasants who have ditched all these modern conveniences that have made us modern humans lazy, and they live like God intended for us to live, which I'm sure they do, but that doesn't make them perfect. The Amish culture is still very strict, and there are plenty of scandals coming from the Amish community, and traditional farming methods are not necessarily better, which Doug should know if he actually knew anything about farming. All that is to say that Doug wearing these Amish clothes aligns him with the image of the Amish as these great morally righteous farmers, and it primes people to link him with them, and thus giving him the same type of authority that people give the Amish. But let's move on. Let's talk about food. By now, it is very clear to me that Doug and Stacy are not always very honest about the different systems that they have on their homestead. And this becomes the most obvious when they talk about their food growing endeavors and the claims that they make about it. The number that keeps coming up is that they grow 90% of their own food.
Grow 90% of our own food.
We grow 90% of all of our food.
Grow our own food, 90% plus.
But looking at what they show, this just doesn't add up to me. His most viewed video is actually of him building a makeshift chicken tractor for some meat chickens that he has coming in. After that, I've never seen any effort of him trying to keep up this system. They do also have chickens for eggs who free roam the property together with some turkeys and some ducks and some guinea fowl, I think. But I never see him moving this chicken tractor, which is the most efficient way to grow meat chickens. And also knowing that they did not have a working freezer at the time, I just wonder what happened to these 15 chickens that he put into the chicken tractor. I can't imagine Stacy going out once a week to butcher and pluck a chicken for their dinner. Next to the horses that they have and the sheep, they also don't have any other big animals for meat. I can imagine that they buy meat from a local butcher or barter for it or get their meat in some different way, but that quickly becomes the 10% that they're supposedly not growing themselves, especially if you consider calories. Over the years, they also grow different types of berries and they have a bunch of different fruit trees, I think, but nothing too substantial and definitely not enough to eat fruit year round, which I would imagine you would want to. And the vegetables also don't add up. They do grow a nice garden every year. It looks nice. She plants lots of flowers and it looks good. Sure, she talks a lot, but to me, it's clear. She doesn't claim to be knowledgeable, but it's clear to me that she's also not knowledgeable because she repeats things that she's probably just vaguely heard somewhere. Like, for example, she says that comfrey is a nitrogen fixer, which it is not. She also says that mallow grows well. It literally grows right like a weed around here. So I would think that you really need to do something wrong to mess that up. So even if we take that 90% to mean their own vegetables, I don't see it. They only have, from the different pictures that I could see, only have around 12 raised beds. 4 or 5 usually take up by potatoes and sweet potatoes, and a similar amount of space is taken up by herbs. So from my experience as a gardener, this could provide them probably through the summer with fresh vegetables and maybe some to give away, but not enough to preserve to tie them over for the 6 to 8 months that they don't eat out of their garden. I'm just missing some storage crops, like I never see any garlic or any carrots. She has about 3 square meters of potatoes, which, if you're really generous, will give you about 15 kilos of potatoes. And I don't know about you, but we definitely eat more potatoes than that. She has some pumpkins in the background in her kitchen and in the cellar tour, but then I never see the plants in the garden. So it's unclear where they came from, especially since pumpkin vines grow pretty big and they would be hard to miss. She makes pickles in one of their videos, but seeing that she only planted Armenian cucumbers in her garden, those pickling cucumbers probably did not come from her garden. So all this is to say, it's just not adding up to me. Since they love traditional generals, Stacy is always in charge of the gardening and food preservation videos. She loves fermenting, which I think is cool because that's definitely an easier way to preserve things as compared to canning, and creates all sorts of beneficial bacteria for your gut. So that's cool. But do they really eat that every day? In the root cellar tour that they posted in November of 2020, we can see an honest look of the food they store and thus the food that they eat. The majority of the food that she shows in that tour is not homegrown. They have huge buckets filled with all sorts of dried goods like wheat berries and beans and all things that are nice to have, but not homegrown. They only have a few shelves in there, and one of them is completely packed with things from the supermarket. They have tinned fish, they have tinned tomatoes, they have pesto in jars, they have mason jars filled with all sorts of different rice and beans and dent corn and nuts, which again is great to have, but it's just not homegrown, which is interesting because dent corn is apparently very easy to grow, so I don't understand why they don't grow that. There is applesauce, there is pumpkin puree, pie filling, soy sauce, you name it, it's there. For a long time, Stacy seemed to be against canning, which is interesting because it's so popular within the homesteading community. But then in 2022, in another tour, I do see some home canned goods on the shelf, so maybe she canned those, I don't know. If she does, that's cool because that's also a great way to store food. But there are only 100 jars, and that's when I'm really, really generous. There are definitely not 100 jars on those shelves. That's barely enough to have one can for 3 months, which is not a whole winter. So you can't tell me that feeds them over the winter. You just cannot. The math is not mathing, as they say. Especially if you are, like they claim to be, health conscious, which would mean to me that you eat a lot of vegetables throughout the day. 1 can a day is just not going to do it. I don't can at the moment because we don't really have the space for that. But looking at other root cellar tours here on YouTube, Doug and Stacy's root cellar just looks really bare. Granted, a lot of these tours are for people with very big families, but there are also a couple channels where it's just the couple and they put up a lot more food, which I think gives a much more realistic idea of how much food you need to put up to feed yourself throughout the year. Obviously, you don't need to can if you don't want to. I think social media definitely has created one way of eating from your property, which I don't think is very fair. There are lots of ways to eat from your property that don't involve much canning, but then I don't see Doug and Stacy doing those other things either. So I really doubt that they eat 90% of their vegetables grown from their own garden. But to me, that just shows one of the problems with this type of content. Many, if not most, of the viewers don't grow their own food. So it's really hard for people to imagine how much food you actually need to grow to eat from your garden year-round. Sure, her garden looks nice and it's productive. I won't deny that. But in my opinion, of course, it simply does not produce the kind of quantities that you need to grow to get to the 90% of eating your own food that they claim that they do. Especially having seen that they live in a climate where it gets really, really cold through the winter, and thus you can't eat from your garden for quite a few months. I don't see it. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't buy from someone else. I'm just saying that they should be more honest and realistic about this percentage. So those were some of my thoughts on the basics, on how they live, on their off-grid systems and their food, and how they're not completely honest about a lot of things, in my opinion, of course. So now I'd like to get into some of the more controversial stuff. For this video, I obviously looked at what some other people had to say about Doug and Stacy. One of the most viewed videos that called them out directly was this video by Hillside Homestead. In this video, they discussed similar things as I just did, about how they don't seem to be honest about a lot of things, and that they do a lot of fear-mongering, which I will discuss momentarily. Like her, I think the math is just not mathing when it comes to their food growing claims. There are not enough animals on their property, and their garden is just not big enough. Little side note though, in this video she keeps saying, no one lives like this. Which is funny to me because a lot of people actually do. Their cabin is bigger than our apartment in the city ever was. And their cabin looks very comfortable to me, at least, especially considering that it's just the two of them. And now that they have added solar, there's not much more that I would change about how they have set things up, except for adding a pressure pump to their catchment system, because that would make everything easier. But I also understand that off-grid living is not for everyone, and everyone has different comfort levels. I just thought it was funny that she is so adamant that no one lives like this. Definitely can be done and can be very comfortable. But aside from all that, I thought it was very telling how Doug reacted to this video. He clearly has a lot of groupies, but he himself is also not very good at taking any level of critique. Apparently he wrote a lot of nasty comments that I have to believe Jesse on when he talks about that in his second video. But those get deleted through the YouTube algorithm pretty immediately, especially if you use nasty words. And then Doug apparently also threatened to sue him, which is interesting, so seeing that he doesn't have any ground to do that. And I've also noticed that Doug doesn't just comment on the videos that get a lot of view, like that hillside homestead video did, but he also comments on the tiniest little channels that have off-grid grifter in their title, with videos with just a couple thousand views. So I'm definitely expecting some BS after posting this video about him, but it's all based on fair use, and it's all based on what he is sharing in his videos himself, and my opinion on that. I'm just wondering that if he is actually so confident as he tries to appear in his videos, why would he care if people have critique of him? He just comes across as someone who is very, very invested in having other people know that he is the best, and that he knows the best, and that he's the smartest off-grid man of them all, which would be one thing if he was, but he clearly isn't. And this goes back to the clothing thing as well. He clearly wants to create this image of a wise man who can teach you all about off-grid living, and then, of course, sell you a membership, but we'll talk about that in a moment. So this idea that apparently they don't live in their cabin is shared by people in the comments, but for as far as I couldn't find any evidence of them living somewhere else. So unless they have a whole different house in a different area that's maybe not even in their name, I do actually believe that they live in this cabin. One thing that is completely unclear to me, though, is whatever happened to that cabin giveaway. In September of 2020, Doug made a video with a big announcement about how they were going to give away a log cabin once they reached 1 million subscribers. It makes this big story about wanting to give back to his subscribers, and they have this goal of getting to 1 million. So they will give away a cabin once they get to that goal. 3 days though, after posting that first video, he already posted another video with the title, "We Can't Give Away a Log Cabin." And he repeats the need for this 1 million subscriber count. But what is completely unclear to me is if they actually gave away a cabin. I even made a comment asking him about this, to ask if there was a video where he showed whoever got this cabin. He never answered, and I do know that he reads his comments, because anytime I comment something political, he answers pretty much straight away, so he definitely reads his comments. In the months following this big announcement about this giveaway, they do reach the 1 million subscriber goal. But at the same time, he also starts to build a log cabin for his mom on their property, and this giveaway is just never heard of again. So if this is true, that they never gave away this log cabin, I think it's another great example of some of their more shady marketing tactics to get more views, more subscribers, and thus in the end, more customers for their various courses and products and live events. I couldn't make up a good segue to talk about the Switch, but here we go. The first videos of Doug's that are still public are the type of video that you would expect from a middle-aged man posting on YouTube in 2013. He's definitely a guy who's never held a camera before. He seems genuine in wanting to share what they're doing around the homestead. None of this looks faked for the camera, to me at least. The footage is shaky, the lighting is terrible, and the resolution is what you expect from a phone from 2013. But I say videos that are still public because I do feel like there are some videos that he has privated over the years. There certainly are a lot of very big gaps in between the videos that are still public on his channel, but this could also just be someone who's not taking it as serious as someone would take it these days. So it could be just normal behavior that he doesn't post for months on end. At the end of one of his earlier videos titled Off-Grid Homestead Gets Solar Power, Doug does have a long rant about all the things that he's going to share in upcoming videos. Honestly, I have no clue what he is talking about, but that's because I'm not that deep into all these different Bible interpretations. But he does seem very eager to share his Bible studies with people and to have discussions around this type of thing. And that's all good and fine. I just find it interesting that those videos don't seem to be public anymore, and that for at least a time he didn't really discuss religion on his channel. When I watched many years ago in their normal phase, I really don't remember, and I've heard this from more people, that I really don't remember him talking about the Bible this much. So at least for a few years he really did keep his beliefs to himself. I can only wonder why that is though. But considering the shift that we'll look at in a minute, I think it has something to do with what gets good views. And then to be clear, I really don't care about if people are religious or not, because frankly, that's none of my business. What I do care about though is when people use a religion as a veil to look like a good person, when they are in fact pumping out hateful content and spreading disinformation that could potentially hurt people. When you have a big platform, people will believe what you say. It really is that simple. So you have to take on that responsibility of providing good information to people and not spreading hate, I think, and to not mislead people. For many years, they post very normal, middle-of-the-road content about their homestead, with titles like, What You Don't Know About Marigolds, Garden Superstar. I have a problem in the barn, plus garden harvest and recipe. Very typical titles for YouTube at that time. Sometimes they'll have videos that do really, really well, but for years they had views from around 50,000 to 100,000, which is pretty decent and can provide you with a decent income as well, but nothing really extravagant. But then we slowly start to see a shift. Interestingly, at least to me, is that this didn't really begin in 2020, like you might expect if you know where we're going. But in 2020, he was building this cabin for his mom, so he was mostly posting content about that. I just think that it took him a little bit of time to realize how well conspiracy-related content can perform on this platform. So in May of 2022, they start posting multiple videos about food shortages and what to do and what to prepare for, and they do all right. Then later on, they post a few videos about what to do when the grid goes down, which provides pretty basic and all right information to people who have never thought about prepping and have never thought about the grid going down. Videos do above average, let's say that. But then in July of 2022, Doug goes viral with a video titled U.S. Marshals Raid Amish for Food. Small homesteads next. And that video is very clearly a turning point. It now has over 2 million views. And from the title, you might think that they sent in a SWAT team of 25 men, all with full black outfits, raiding this Amish farmer's farm.
To me, right? I don't want to be out here shuffling any kind of misinformation or, getting you guys all spiked up when you don't need to be.
That's not how the story went, though. This was an Amish farmer who was already in court multiple times around food safety on his farm because it wasn't going too great. I'll post a couple things in the description box, but safe to say, this was not someone who was just farming and selling his excess produce. This was someone who had been arguing with officials for years at this point about how he ran his farm. And then in the end, there were just a couple US Marshals, so kind of like police going into this place to, I think, enforce a court order of this man that this man already had on him. So not as extreme as you might expect from this title. But since it went really viral, 2 million views is pretty good. From that point on, the views on his channel never really dip below 100k and regularly go much higher than that. Now we see titles like "Cash is gone, get ready, it is now law." Another one that did really well was "Amish warning about chickens and eggs." But what it comes down to is that it's just video after video using fear-mongering news from really shoddy websites and just repeating the same talking points over and over again. It is exactly what you expect. It is the kind of babbling that we're so used to by now. They, whomever they are poisoning our food. They are messing with the chicken feed. They are letting in tsunamis of immigrants that are now also eating your pets. Any and all conspiracies come by. If you've ever heard of it, Doug has probably talked about it. And here's the thing. He's using people's fear to make money. It really is that simple. Because yes, it is good to be prepared for power outages. Yes, it is true that food prices have gone up immensely. Yes, it is true that harvests around the world are failing and the weather is messed up, but that's certainly not the fault of the poor and underpaid immigrants who are probably picking the vegetables that Doug and Stacy still buy at the supermarket. I could make a 3-hour-long video debunking all the BS that Doug has posted every other day now and even every day now, but I won't, because I don't think that's really constructive. What I'm just realizing making this video is that I'm trying to find some sort of logic in his way of thinking. But that's impossible because people like this, people like Doug, contradict themselves all the time. There is no rhyme or reason unless you are in the in crowd and you already agree with what he says. And I'm honestly not sure if he actually believes half the stuff he says on his channel these days. But it is certainly getting more eyes on his content, and that's all that matters in the end. Honestly, his content has never done better, and that's the actual goal. Because remember, Doug used to be in sales. Now he's just selling a story. He's trying to keep your attention so that he can make money on the ads that you are watching. And let me get back to this point as well. He's trying to market himself as the guy who knows best, who's done it for so long, and who can now teach you to do the same. The simple game plan is, in essence, talk about fears over and over again, and then once you go looking for someone to help you, to guide you through these fears, and isn't that neat then? That here is Mr. Off-Grid himself, who is here to help you with all your problems and teach you all the things that you need to know. But all the scary stuff, of course, is free to watch. And then to actually learn, you need to buy their books, their ebooks. You need to join their membership where they teach you all these practical things. I don't know what is behind this paywall because I didn't want to give them my money, but I do know. And I hope I have shown you earlier in this video, they are not so knowledgeable as they market themselves. They just talk a good talk. And by now, it's not just the books and the courses they are selling. At the end of every video I've seen from this year, they have this little ad for their tea business. They also regularly try to shill their solar ovens and their beeswax candles and copper mugs. And that's all fine and good. I'm not against trying to sell stuff and use your channel to promote these things, but especially their live streams these days are mostly him trying to remember the viewer. that they can buy all these things, and it just feels like you're watching the shopping channel. So, whatever happened to Doug and Stacy? I don't think anything in particular happened. They seem, or he seems at least, to have always had these fringe beliefs even before they started posting. He just never shared them as open and as bluntly as he does these days. I find the hard pivot that Doug made in his content to conspiracy content ever so fascinating, honestly. This type of content has been on the rise since 2020, but Doug just in particular is a very big voice in my particular niche, off-grid homesteading. But at the same time, it's just such a clear grift. It really couldn't be more clear. He just serves as a great textbook example of how these grifters go viral and then will just ride that wave, just repeating the same old talking points. He rarely, if ever, shows his homestead anymore, and he frankly doesn't need to. The yelling about chemtrails and farmer oppression is getting him a lot more views, and thus a lot more money. And it also doesn't require a lot of thinking either, because he can just repeat the same thing over and over again. Which brings me to a big gripe that I have with his content these days. So much of the content now is so fucking low effort. It really drives me insane. When he's not just reading aloud some news, between air quotes, article or some Facebook post, he's literally just reposting other people's content. He will regularly just make a short little intro, a minute and a half. Guys, you really have to hear this. And then the next 15 to 20 minutes is just someone else's video. It's just RFK talking about whatever. It's just some lady who apparently worked for some government institution exposing all the things that the government doesn't want you to know. It's not even his own content. And then he has the gall to then complain about his videos getting demonetized. He's trying to say to the viewer, oh, it is because of the what the content is saying. But no, it's really just as simple as it's not even your own content. And when he does talk, he just repeats the same things over and over again. He will be talking about some farming related things, and then 30 seconds later, he's complaining about trans people. He's complaining about immigrants. He's just listing all the things that are trending within the conservative media landscape at the moment. He's just... Trans people have nothing to do with farming. So I really wanted to make this video because over the years, I have seen some people hint at the fact that they don't believe with his fear-mongering. They don't appreciate his sales tactics. But for some reason, people are too polite to call it out directly. So that's why I made this little, this fairly long probably, deep dive for you. Here I am. I'm not afraid. I don't mind being impolite. In my opinion, Doug is not this humble yet all-knowing man he makes himself out to be. He is just a textbook grifter, riding the wave of fear that people have around the current food system and making himself rich in the process. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into Doug and Stacy. I could have put so many more small things into this video, but it was already getting quite long. Like the fact that because Doug did not want to install a pressure pump for years on end, Stacy had to water the gardens for hours. Why? I don't know. Why did that take him so long? You clearly have time for all your nice machines. Why not make her life easier as well? But I think we all know why he did not do that. Anyway, I could go on for hours, and I'll just leave you here. I'll see you in the next one.